Con un timing increíble, Resistencia se estrenó en medio del conflicto entre guionistas y actores de Hollywood contra el uso de inteligencia artificial, pero, de acuerdo a su director de fotografía, nada tiene que ver esta temática, o por lo menos no directamente. De esto y un montón de cosas más hablamos en este informe sobre Resistencia.
We now return to Mira Akien and Contre with our latest interview.
I think there was a desire that Gareth had to sort of harken back to that filmmaking style, but on a larger canvas. Obviously, Monsters was a very small scale, low budget film made for $250,000. So I think he wanted to, after directing a Star Wars film and Godzilla, like had a real interest in creating another film on that canvas, but going back to his sort of more scrappy guerrilla indie filmmaking roots. Gareth was inspired by so many things. Like Gareth is such a filmmaker's filmmaker. Like he's one of those directors who just loves movies, knows everything about movies. He's been a movie geek his whole life, watched a ton of them, basically has these classics memorized, like Alien, Blade Runner, obviously the original Star Wars. So all of those references are always swirling around in his head. And I think he really sees the world through a camera lens. There's a few other references in there. So this film was inspired by the documentary Baraka, which is this stunningly beautiful nature documentary from the early 90s from the cinematographer of Koyane Skatsi, if anybody's familiar. One of the most beautifully shot films ever made, and it's completely documentary footage, natural, available light, like no artificiality whatsoever. And yeah, it's really worth seeking out. We were inspired by Terrence Malick. We were inspired by Akira and anime. So there's a lot of influences in there. And I think from a process standpoint, our biggest influence was Gareth's first movie, Monsters.
The artificial intelligence created to protect us detonated a nuclear warhead in Los Angeles. This is a fight for our very existence.
I think Gareth's thesis on that is science fiction and fantasy are already asking a lot from an audience to suspend disbelief, right? You need to believe in this fictional world with robots and spaceships and factions and all of these other, world building details that you need to buy into. And I think that Gareth's thought process there is the more realistic and the more grounded a world feels, the more an audience is willing to surrender themselves over to that world. So that was really the driving force behind the idea of shooting this film with that kind of documentary style. But we also wanted it to feel refined and aesthetic and cinematic and elevated. And so for us, it was constantly finding that very thin tightrope. All the visual decisions that we made also helped create the actors, also help give the actors like a world to play in. So yeah, at the end of the day, it all was designed to serve that purpose, to create something that feels believable. Gareth has a funny thing that he says where he's been saying, when you write a science fiction film, you have to kind of come up with a date that it takes place in, like in the future, because if you set it too close, then you age yourself, like how 2001, A Space Odyssey, 2001 came and went and we did not colonize the moon, and we don't have intergalactic space travel. The Fifth Element, Blade Runner was set in 2019 and we sailed right past that. So if you set it too close, it feels a little skeptical. But so he picked 2070 as a setting only because it felt far enough away that you could get away with anything. But then what he's been saying is like, well, now with all of the conversation going on with AI, he should have set it closer, because 2070 feels too far into the future. But it's obviously just meant as sort of set as somewhat of a joke.
They protected me.
They're not people, Maya. It's just programming.
I don't know when you start to shoot this film, but it was released like in the midst of writers and actors fighting against, among other things, AI. So it's like you couldn't like see that coming, I think, but it's believable.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that the timing, to be honest, was completely coincidental because the movie was written in 2018, 2019, so about 4 years ago, and we filmed it in 2021, 2022. So ChatGPT only really showed up at the end of 2022. And actually, I remember on set, Gareth showed up one day and was showing us all this article. This happened midway through the shoot. The article about the Google engineer that sort of talked about their experience with a chatbot, an AI chatbot.
Yeah.
So that was happening while we were filming. So the film was never really designed or intended as a comment on like the current state of AI. It was more designed to use robots and AI as a metaphor for, the other oppressed people, scapegoats, like political scapegoats, basically the way that robots had been used in science fiction for many years before, like going back to Isaac Asimov and Foundation and the iRobot storylines and all of that, and Philip K. Dick. Like these were high concept science fiction from the 50s and 60s that were using robots as a metaphor. I think that's really where the immersiveness comes from, is we shot in real locations with real people. The costumes, the props, a lot of work went into making those look weathered and real and believable, and a lot of work went into designing those. We partnered with Weta Workshop in New Zealand, who worked on Lord of the Rings most famously, to sort of design and fabricate all of that. And yeah, the goal really was knowing that there was going to be a whole other layer of the film added in VFX that elevates the scale and sort of adds a lot of the science fiction to the environments in the background, and also turns some of the characters into robots. Like we knew that all of that was going to happen. So then the goal is, how much footage and location work and people and references can we capture in camera that feel grounded and real? And the more stuff that feels grounded in the frame, the more the visual effects will also feel grounded, because they are designed to enhance and match and augment the real footage that we captured, in the real people and the real props, the real costumes, the real weapons and everything.
What do you want, sweetie?
For robots to be free.
Madeline's incredible. I mean, she is such a revelation and such a discovery. We were all so blown away by her on set every day. And, she has those emotional scenes in the film, and every time she performed one of those on set, it was like magic and everybody was crying. So yeah, it was really incredible and very special. It's one of those things where, that relationship between Alfie and Josh is the core of the movie. So like, if that doesn't work, the movie doesn't work. They met up beforehand. I think Gareth took them both to Disneyland. This is well before the shoot, like once they were cast, but before we started filming. So they started to get to know each other. Madeline lives in San Diego, so she's not far away from Los Angeles. So I think they were just able to meet up and sort of build a chemistry and build a friendship. Like John David really just became kind of like her big brother. Like she was just constantly goofing around with him, always wanted to be around him, was always like wanted to tell him about whatever she had going on, like in Roblox that day, or like tell him about like some toys that she misses at home or anything. Like it was so loving, and John David was so open with her, and just like a cool uncle, basically, who was just like, I'm down for anything you want to do. Like, I'm going to meet your energy. I'm going to be at your level. And I think that bond was essential for their characters and for that chemistry. The hardest part was that there's a sequence of scenes from where they just meet each other that take place early in the film, where they are not supposed to have a close relationship. They're supposed to be quite apart. And so that was really the hardest part, is to act like you don't know each other and don't care about each other, and let that relationship and that bond grow throughout the narrative.
Did you locate the weapon?
Yeah, it's just a kid.
I think Star Wars is just in Gareth's DNA. Like, he is one of the guys, and by the way, it's in my DNA too, because I grew up, my first love of films was Star Wars as a very young kid. And I was a big Star Wars nerd growing up as a kid, and I read all the books, and I watched the movies so many times. And so Star Wars has been a big part of my life, and it had been a big part of Gareth's life as well. So there wasn't necessarily any discussions that we had of intentionally evoking anything from Rogue One. But I think that style of filmmaking and the filmmaking that's on display in Rogue One is so in tune with Gareth's psyche and his sort of the way he views cinema. And also Rogue One is really just a real manifestation of his taste as a filmmaker, in terms of how he moves the camera and how things look and the scale and scope of everything. And I think that just naturally carried over into this. In fact, there were actually some times where we felt like we were doing something that was too Star Wars, and we felt that we should pivot away from it. Like sometimes you would just catch yourself. And I know that in the design process with the production designer, James Klein, who also worked on Star Wars, he worked on a lot of the newer films. Those conversations came up all the time. Like, I think just Star Wars is so pop culturally ubiquitous, especially with science fiction, that inevitably your brain just ends up going in that direction. So even when they were designing some things, every once in a while they would pause and have to say, like, wait a second, is this too Star Wars? Maybe we went a little bit too close to it. We're evoking it a little bit too much. So let's scale it back. But yeah, it didn't stop ILM from putting a few Rogue One Easter eggs in the movie, which I think is very fun. There's two very specific Rogue One Easter eggs that are in the movie. Yeah, so in the end, the DNA of it is ingrained in the film just as much as the DNA of Godzilla is in the film, and the DNA of monsters, and the DNA of all the other films that we intentionally referenced. It ends up all getting mixed together in the pot of influences. But yeah, there's definitely some echoes for sure that were mostly unintentional, but I think it's just a natural result of the process that some of that stuff ends up in the film.